Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Test, 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 test.
Can someone talk on both of them at the same time? Test one, two.
Velina ke aloha kākua pauloa. Before we begin, may I ask you all to come forward? It's going to be easy for us to hear everyone. We do have microphones we'll take to you, but it'll help honor the space that we're together. If you don't mind coming up, at least in this first area here, and that we can see each other, we'll hear each other well. If you don't mind, everyone, if you could move up. And then we have some mea'ai that we have too. Please grab some as you come forward. And then make your way to this area here, if I can kindly ask. And we'll begin very shortly with a pule and some other great opening things before we start the meeting. So if you don't mind, please come forward. And please get some mea'ai. Hallelujah. Mahalo nui loia oko e ka ohana o ko Ōlauloa Hawaiian Civic Club. He mea mina maika inoho I ke ia hui ana o ka ako a Pauloa ke ia ahi nei. Ano ka mea kapanui o mākou ke ohana o ka ke hana kulehana Hawaii he maulala o ka hui civil Hawaii. No leila he mea maika I he vai noho I ka ke kipa ana mai ia oko a Pauloa na oko e ho kipa mai ia mākou. E ololo kākou e ho malu kākou I ka leo pule. E kia li Kamakako lani ki ke loa o ko ke ao holo okoa. E ia ho I mākou kaupo e ohana I aku ko mei nei I mō koalo. Ke ho nani ho maika I mili lani ho sana ka nei mākou ia o e ke ku. A o iai e kuno haa nei ko mākou po o ke ho nani ka nei mākou ia o. Nau e maliu mai, nau e ho lono mai a mākou a Paul ka mākou e noi nei. E noi nei, e paholo mai o I kau aloha malu no mākou pakahi a pau. Mai kahi kihiki o ke ia kela kihiki o ke ia hale nei e ku nei. Ke e kua nau e malama I a mākou. E ho mai ka I ka mea ai ho mākou kau ia. Nā mākou no e ai. Ho mākou kau ia mākou. O iai mākou e hoi ke nei ke ia kuleana a mākou e au amo nei. O mākou nei ke ana kuleana Hawaii. A pea ka mākou hui ho ana malo kou malo. I loko ki e pohai o ki ia po e nei. O ki au o Kahuku, la ie paha, a pia puhu o ko Ōlauloa. No leila ki e kua, ke noi ku nei ia o e malama pakahi a mākou a Pauloa. Ko mākou wala au ana, ki kuka ana, and now e paholo mai o I ko aloha, malu na mākou pakahi a pau. Ke e ku, ke noi ku nei a paaki e papahano ki iahiahi, e hoi ia ia mākou ko aku wahi kupono ki iahiahi, me ka palekana. Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you, asking for your aloha. Asking that your aloha be spread upon us all. We come from our āina nei. We may come from different parts, but we love our āina because you have blessed us with it. Kia kua, we come and we ask that you instill this aloha, that you've taught us that God is love. And if love is aloha, then God is aloha. Therefore, kia kua, we ask for that aloha to be with us through this day. A very difficult and yet a complex and yet an important conversation we have, kia kua. Kia kua, we ask that you rest our souls with aloha, and when the evening is complete, you take us home safely. Bring us back when your eyes deem it the right time that we are together. No lele ke ku ke pule nei mako ia oi, ke ia mau manao. Mau kaino o Yesu Kristo kumako haku. Amen. This friendly Aloha Hawaiian Civic Club for extending their aloha to us and for welcoming us into your āina. Although many of us have ties either here or elsewhere on this land, it's so important that we are properly given that permission. And thank you to Aloha Hawaiian Civic Club. I did mention that many of us who work for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs actually belong to a Hawaiian Civic Club in our areas or anything. So this is all ohana to us. And at this time, I'm going to introduce our interim CEO administrator, and I think she'll complete other introductions. And so please welcome at this time. And by the way, if you haven't gotten your mea, please go ahead and do so at any time. This is Summer Silva.
Mahalo. Thank you. By the way, mahalo hai lama for such a beautiful grounding pule, and to the Civic Club for the warmest Elina Mai and a hospitable reception. We're so grateful. I'm actually especially moved because, you know, we started these conversations in November of 2025. And at the time, condemnation was felt like a really real threat being discussed and presented as if it was an inevitability. And so the conversations we were having in community were very heavy, very, very triggering, felt very like dismal in some ways. And as the months have progressed and we've met with more community across the Pai'aina and have become more conversant in both the recognition of these ancestral lands, their character, their kuleana that has, pretty much been passed from one generation to the next, and our responsibility to continue to steward them in very like aloha āina values. The conversations have become more hopeful and more filled with a sense that we have agency. And the threat of condemnation is less of a threat and more of something that we are, as a collective, resistant to. OHA's conversation and positioning in this space has been informed all along the way from the communities that we've met with and heard from, and it has helped guide the Board of Trustees in their evolving understanding of their kuleana and their responsibility to be as responsive as they can be to OHA beneficiaries. And so I mahalo you for being part of the ongoing conversation and for allowing us to spend some time presenting what we've learned and that what we have access to in terms of information and position statements that we're getting from the federal government as well as the state government, the executive branch, what we've heard from community, and then most importantly, what we're going to be able to learn from this community to continue to informing our decision-making and our advocacy in this space. You know, I'm reminded that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was born of a resistance movement. And so it's very apropos that in this moment, when we're talking about tens of thousands of acres of land and the future opportunities, the future co-management, co-stewardship responsibilities, that we do so very clear that our charge remains the same, to be an agency grounded in aloha āina, to be an agency principally responsible for advocating on behalf of the Native Hawaiian community, being very like leaders in the space, because that is our constitutional mandate, that is our continuing obligation to the beneficiaries, not just of our generation, but of future generations, and a responsibility that we owe to all those who entrusted us with this resource and this stewardship. I am also very honored that we have a trustee here this evening with us, Trustee Dana Huna, who, yes, please, mahalo, Trustee Ahuna, who has been a champion for the community in every space that we've been in. And a reminder, a very meaningful reminder for the board and for the agency that so much of our authority and so much of our reason for existing has to be grounded in community voices, the diverse experiences that the community makes us aware of and responsive to. And so I mahalo him for being here tonight on behalf of the Board of Trustees in his representative capacity. I'm also joined by our Chief Advocate, Lena Alale, who's been stewarding this conversation. Yes, please mahalo her big time. Lei is our principal spokesperson at the legislature, at the state legislature, where she has been making great inroads, great strides in educating and uplifting the voices of our community to all of the lawmakers and those directors and appointees in the different executive agencies who are going to have a hand in the disposition of these lands. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lena Ala. Thank you. Should I just jump into it?
Mahalo again for having us. It's so nice to be welcomed by members of the community. And this isn't supposed to be a dialogue as well as a presentation. So the goals for the evening are to get through this PowerPoint, which we have as handouts at the front, by 7:15, so that the remainder of the time that we have is actually listening to feedback from the community, answering questions, and just taking down your mana'o so that we understand where this community stands on this issue. And I just wanted to note, we have index cards at the front. If you have questions that pop into your mind, if you could just write them down and someone can collect them later, just so we kind of can get through the material, which is kind of dense at times. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. But if we could save the questions for the end, I think that would just help us get past the point where we're talking to you and more to the point where we're listening, which is really the goal of this. We want to listen to the community. But we did want to go through some fundamentals. And I guess before we move on to the next slide, I'll just share my background as a Native Hawaiian rights litigator. And I've really dedicated what was my legal career to serving community in a very different role in the courtroom. But I'm honored to be at ʻŌhau, where I can continue doing what I feel is my calling, which is to use my legal degree to really serve the community. So I'm grateful again and humbled for you to have us. Next slide, please. So Summer touched upon all these points already, but I want to highlight a few themes that are going to run through tonight's presentation, and we'll go back to as kind of the touchstone of what we're talking about, because every single piece of military leased lands is Crown and government lands that was seized during the overthrow and given to the state upon admission to the United States in 1959. And imprinted with a trust responsibility, 5 trust responsibilities, one of which is the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. And as of 1978, when ʻŌhau was, as Summer mentioned, born from community activism based on broken promises to Native Hawaiians, ʻŌhau was to receive money that the state earns from the Public Land Trust, which again is Crown and government lands, and to utilize that money to finally meet the mandate given to the state in 1978 to better the conditions of Native Hawaiians. So that is ʻŌhau's purpose and reason for existence. And with that comes, we share with the state what is called fiduciary duties to our beneficiaries, which for ʻŌhau is Native Hawaiians. And that means we have a very high level of legal obligation to protect and represent Native Hawaiian interests, which include not only those monies that are supposed to be dedicated to the community for programs and services, which you can grab some literature about in the back. What do we do to help the community? How are we helping to better the conditions of Native Hawaiians? We have a bunch of programs we want you to read about, but we also have a primary duty to advocate for Native Hawaiian rights, and that includes protection of the national claims of Native Hawaiians to those Crown and government lands that were taken. So that informs OHA's role in this conversation and why we have, again, that high fiduciary duty to our community to be leading on this conversation, to be a voice demanding that the governor, that the federal administration, that state decision makers listen to Native Hawaiians and consult with Native Hawaiians, and to try and elevate what is the mana'o of this community. And it's rooted in the Constitution and our trust duties to the public lands. I'm going to call them the public lands, but they are, again, Crown and government lands. And we're going to go over that history now. Very briefly, I feel like a lot of folks might be familiar with this, but we want to honor our Ike Kupuna and how our ancestors, including Kamakako, who wrote the first constitution and oversaw privatization of land, how our ancestors looked at land, and it really was communal, which is why we have this quote up here that although Kamehameha I was the founder of the kingdom, the land belonged to him. It was not his private property, but it was really, again, his trustee, that same concept that OHA has, and it was managed on behalf and for the good of the community with the ali'i and with the makainana. And when the mahele came, the original intent of Kamakako was that 1/3 of the land would go to the crown, 1/3 to the ali'i, and the remaining 1/3 to the makainana. And that wasn't, we know what history, how it played out, but Kamakako and what was in with his power honored that vision and foresight. And the first thing he did the first selection of land in the mahele. And what he did was he instantly gave more than half of what he had claimed for the crown back to the kingdom of Hawaii to have that land support the kingdom's government, and really at that time his people, and all they were trying to accomplish on the world stage. And then he kept the smaller remainder of the land he chose as the crown land to be held by his family and his heirs. And we have that chart up there. His piece that he took was the yellow, the smaller, the big turquoise piece was given back to the government. The ali'i is the purple, and then the makainana is the smallest slice. But again, he honored what was in his control, which was giving back his portion of the land to help upkeep the kingdom, the better portion of his land. And throughout the history of the kingdom, until the overthrow, both the government lands and many of the ali'i lands were used also to support Native Hawaiians. And that's why today we have these ali'i trusts, because again, it was this idea and continuity of ali'i serving the community. But what we also we saw happen during this period was, of course, imperial US expansion, and much of it led by the military, which is part of our conversation tonight. So the first kind of big diminishment of Native Hawaiian power in the kingdom was under the Bayonet Constitution in 1887. And that was in part, it was sugar interests wanted to get access to US markets, but the US military also wanted to get access to Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor. So one of the initial, again, diminishments of Hawaiian power was in concert with military interest in acquiring land in Hawaii. And then when we get to the overthrow, of course, that was led by local sugar oligarchy. But again, with the support of the US Navy that was landed the same day of the overthrow and had troops march through Honolulu to the palace. And it was that military power and backing that helped ensure the success of what was really a very minority party within the Kingdom of Hawaii. The small, what did they call themselves? Committee of Safety that overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom. It was a very small group of people, but they had the backing of the United States military. So we're going to focus, that's a whole big history, and we acknowledge there's a lot of generational trauma, and that's a whole presentation on its own in discussion, but we're really going to focus on what happened with the lands that were taken as part of the overthrow and what happened next. And I do want to note, as Summer mentioned, we're in this legacy and this continuance of Native Hawaiian resistance. And that is what we saw between 1893 and 1898. There was massive Native Hawaiian organizing against the overthrow of the Queen, the transfer of Hawaiian lands and government to the United States. And that's part of the reason that it took that many years, 5 years, for the small oligarchy of sugar planters to accomplish what they thought was going to be really a quick process to get taken into the United States and annexed. But it turned out that, you know, it was apparent. The Queen yielded her power under protest. And there was at the time a president who listened and recognized and published a report about how the kingdom was taken against the will of the government and the majority of the population. And there were also the Kue petitions, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, but nearly 90% of Native Hawaiians signed, tens of thousands of individuals opposing the annexation of Hawaii to the United States. And those were delivered by the Hui Aloha āina to decision makers in DC. And that was part of the consideration. But eventually, they were able in 1898 to finally, through a joint resolution, to acquire Hawaii. And this was, of course, in the context of the Spanish-American War. There were a lot of other countries that were taken at the same time, Puerto Rico, Philippines. So it was kind of an imperial grab party they had that year. And they finally took Hawaii after these 5 years of resistance. And what happens at this point, before they're taken, is the local government, the Republic of Hawaii, that was founded by that oligarchy, they merged the crown and government land. So essentially, Queen Liliuokalani was deprived of what was her private property. And to this day, while we recognize the importance of the public land trust in totality as being kingdom lands, it's also really, really important to remember those crown lands, because they were taken away from Liliuokalani as our monarch in her personal capacity. And there continues to be controversy till today about legally what does that mean about the status of those lands. Next slide, please. So this emphasizes some of the points I went over, but the Newlands Resolution, again, 1898, imperial expansion, it has been recognized, and it was recognized in 1993 in the Apology Resolution. This was without the consent of Native Hawaiians, and it was not by treaty, it was by joint resolution, which is not the normal way to bring in a new territory. But the one thing that was preserved, even in the context of the Newlands Resolution, was recognition that the public lands in Hawaii were unique, and the laws of the United States related to public lands were never extended to the territory of Hawaii. We were kept under our own legal regime, which had many problems. It was not a free and consensual democracy in many ways, but it was locally managed as far as the lands. Next slide, please. And this again was actually the founding, the Organic Act was what organized the territory. And again, it recognized that local land laws would apply, but the right that it reserved, which was exercised throughout the territorial period, was the right of the federal government to take or to have land set aside by the governor, who was also appointed by the president. So it was a very kind of insider's game. It was old boys network in the highest sense of who was in power and who had decision making. And there were hundreds of thousands of acres that were set aside during the territorial period, much of it for parks, and the next largest category being for military. Next slide, please. So what we do see during this period is the expansion in the context of United States law of the federal trust responsibility and obligations to Native Hawaiians. And we have in 1920, thanks to the advocacy of Prince Jonah Kuhio, we have the passage of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. And in his advocating for passage of that bill, he always spoke about Hawaiians' moral claims to land in Hawaii. And that that found a receptive audience to some degree. People recognized that there had been a wrong and that there was some degree of remedy that was required to compensate Native Hawaiians. And while this was a very small act of compensation that has created a lot of controversy in our community with the blood quantum, it was in fact legally a recognition of a wrong done to Hawaiians, the fact that we are the indigenous Native peoples of Hawaii and that we have certain rights that other citizens and in communities are distinct. We have distinct rights. And that's consistent with how federal Indian tribes are treated. Again, we have the 1959 Admissions Act, which I already went over. It had those 5 trust purposes, making the state of Hawaii as a condition of accepting these lands that were being held, ultimately title was in the United States at that point. As a condition of them being returned to the state, there were the 5 trust purposes, including the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. And what we also have in the Admissions Act is a recognition of land that had been set aside during the territorial period. That's all the parklands I was mentioning in the military areas like Pearl Harbor. They, upon passage of the Admissions Act, became the fee simple property of the United States. So we have, at the time of statehood, we do have some of those lands that were part of the Crown and government lands at the time of the overthrow in 1898. They're removed from the public land trust and they're actually taken by the United States, and they show as fee simple owner as the United States today. And then there was another set of land that was under lease. And that's where we get to the military leases that we're talking about today. And those lands, the United States had the opportunity under the Admissions Act, they could keep those in fee simple. They could continue to have an agreement like a lease with a state, or they could give them back to the state. And what happened in this period is that the federal government, not surprisingly, did not choose willingly to return a lot of those lands in this lease category to the state. They wanted to hold on to them. So what we have in 1959 is we have the newly formed state of Hawaii operating at a very weak bargaining position with the United States over what became the military leases that we're talking about now. And these are the dollar military leases. And most people know these are not $1 a year, which would still be too little. It's $1 for the whole term. So those were the conditions, though, under which the local state of Hawaii, the new government, was negotiating with the United States in 1959. So we came out of that period with these military leases expiring today on what everyone, even most of the federal government now admits are very unjust and unfair terms in terms of the lease rent and other conditions of return. There's some cleanup in all of the leases, but it's not as high of a standard as we would expect today. And that's part of the power dynamic. And also the big difference in 1959 is there was no OHA or any recognition really of the need to consult with Native Hawaiians. So that is one of the changes that we are trying to elevate now that we're at this generational moment where these 65-year leases are finally coming up and presenting this opportunity where community can regain access to lands that they haven't had for generations. And then one other thing that happened in 1963 that is important for the community to know is there was a public law passed, and it amended the Admissions Act and made it a condition that if any of the land the federal government had retained during statehood ever became surplus, the federal government had a duty to return it to the state. So if there was lands that was kept, and this would include recreational areas, those would be areas that the federal government under this public law have a duty to return to the state. Here's 1964. I've already talked about the unfair kind of lease terms that political situation resulted in. And then we had an early case that explained some of the principles were already mentioned about what does it mean that the state is a fiduciary over the public land trust. And what that means is it reaffirms that the state's duty is to manage the public lands on behalf of the community. And this was the earliest articulation of that concept, but other folks might be more familiar with the Ching v. Case lawsuit, which was actually litigated by Summer, our CEO, with other attorneys when she was at Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. And it actually sought to enforce the state's public trust duties and how it oversees Pōhakuloa. And it was based on this concept of the public trust that the court was able to rule that the state was not adequately monitoring the leased lands at Pōhakuloa, that it was not upholding its duty to ensure that the military cleans up unexploited ordnance and cleans up or remediates the land after different testing activities. And that sort of right about what is the state going to do to protect the land originates in this public land trust concept. Do you want to add anything about that, Summer?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that was the first real articulation in law that aloha āina, that malama āina, is a recognized legal duty, and it requires something affirmative by trustees to exercise. And what that means is you can't sit back on your obligations. You have to do something proactive. You have to effectively and prudently and consistently and reliably steward the assets that are entrusted to you as part of our public trust doctrine and our public trust laws. And so that particular precedent is why OHA at this moment feels so adamant that we too have a directive, a mandate, not just from the Constitution, not just from our statutes that established our obligations, but from the courts, the highest courts of this state, that we too, as stewards, as trustees of these very uniquely held lands, have an affirmative obligation to safeguard, to protect, to ensure that their vitality, their natural and cultural resources, and their ability to potentially provide economic benefits, and not necessarily just in the Western terms, but in the idea of agriculture and the idea of all of the other ways in which āina helps to sustain and nourish communities, that we have that obligation, and we too cannot sit back on that duty. So that's the only add.
Could I ask you a quick question to make clear, like the aloha āina concept, just to give a little description of the plaintiffs and what they had hoped to accomplish in the lawsuit?
Yes, so Uncle Ku and Auntie Maxine, I'm sorry, both of them were long-standing kia'i over not just Pōhakuloa, but of all the most important wahipana across our pai'aina. And the destructiveness that was happening on the āina, which they were so close to, they had so much pilina to, as well as this complete disregard for cleaning up as you go, for just some very basic malama concepts to ensure that while these lands are in your possession, and also while the underlying leases legally require you to clean as you go, if you are not doing that, then you don't deserve to, one, be using these lands in that harmful manner in which you're using them, and two, to be stewarding these lands if you're not even doing your job. They also clearly wanted an end date to the destructiveness of the military activities ongoing. And quite frankly, we all want an end date. I think that is a shared objective and an underlying goal. And I think the conversation is now moving not to if there will be an end to military use and activity on these lands. But when? And the timeline that we are going to help determine where that expiration and that end date is. I will say that as a member of the Governor's Advisory Committee or Commission on Military Land Leases, even at the executive level, we're having that conversation, that the inevitability of these lands returning to Hawaii and returning to stewardship is very real, is a very conversant option. And that is extremely promising. And again, if you can remember when we started these conversations back in the fall of last year, we were giving up. We were thinking that the federal government was going to condemn and we were going to just sort of accept those terms. Now we're talking about, no, when these lands and their leases expire, what next? What does the utility of those lands look like? What does the remediation of those lands look like? How are we participating in that next chapter? So that's how far the conversation has moved. And I do credit Uncle Ku and Auntie Maxine for bringing what was at that time a conversation happening at the margins, right? To being really public discourse that is very mainstream now. So mahalo.
Mahalo, Summer. And then we have next on the timeline, OHA's creation, which I spoke a little about. Can you advance, please, Alina? And then the next section of the timeline, we are standing on the shoulders of giants when we talk about this military lease conversation, because there were, in fact, a number of community resistance movements against the military leases and leading up to today that I'm sure many people are familiar with, but we'll just touch upon briefly here. We, of course, have in the 1970s, the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana rose up. And Kaho'olawe was actually seized by the military during World War II. And it was used by every single branch of the military as a bombing target. There were torpedoes launched from boats. There was Air Force shooting down at targets. Everyone used it. And at the beginning of the 70s, end of the 60s, they actually simulated the strength of a nuclear bomb by dropping 500-ton bombs in a row and trying to simulate the damage of what that would do. And that's when the water table at Kaho'olawe was broke. If folks don't know that, the water table of the entire island was broken. And it was shortly after that that the first lawsuits were filed by members of Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana to try and stop the bombing. And we also, of course, had the occupation by the Kaho'olawe, the initial Kia'i, where we lost George Helm and Kimo Mitchell. And we see that very on the ground. And the reason the Kaho'olawe story, I think it inspires so many of us, but it has all aspects of community organizing, which is what we're encouraging at OHA. Everyone has their role. So we have the Kia'i who put their bodies on the line and they went on the island and they put themselves there to make the statement that this bombing needs to stop. We have individuals who helped with a lawsuit, and the lawsuit led to a federal consent decree that allowed for greater cultural access and inventory of the archaeological sites. And this legal victory opened the door for the PKO to start having cultural access and to document from that cultural perspective all the historic and cultural sites and how meaningful Kaho'olawe is as an embodiment of Kanaloa and all the cultural significance. And what we have coming out of the consent decree is then we have recognition and law that the whole island itself is culturally significant. And eventually the political movement builds until 1990. Actually, President George Bush, issued an order to stop the bombing of Kaho'olawe. So we have this movement that operated on so many levels and accomplished different things at different points in time. And it was a long, long struggle. And they helped to crack open this door as well about what is possible when we're talking about community resistance to the military. And another interesting thing, if we could actually advance a slide. this is a little bit more about Kaho'olawe, but one thing that's also very interesting about what was able to be accomplished through this community movement is when it came back, the lands came back to the state. And the lands right now are managed by the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve Commission, which is a state entity, but they work very, very closely with the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana and the management and the restoration of the lands. And there's also a provision in the statute establishing Kirk, the commission, and the kind of the cleanup structure at the state level, that these lands are only held in trust by the state, and they will be returned when there is a Native Hawaiian self-governing entity recognized by the United States in the state of Hawaii. So these are PKO members put it this way themselves. When I went to a speech last week at the Hawaiian Convention, they said these are in some ways the first Hawaiian national lands that have been returned because they're being held by the state on just again as a trustee, but recognizing that the next step would be to return these lands to Native Hawaiians. So that is something that members of PKO themselves are proud of and point out about the significance of the return of these lands. And then just the next slide, the other example we have of land coming back is Makua, which again was a very, very long struggle. There was a lawsuit filed in the 1990s by members of the community organized as Malama Makua to stop the bombing. And they actually were able to get a court order against continuing bombing in 2001. And it was a settlement. So basically the pause on live fire training was only supposed to last until the Army completed an environmental review of the training activity, so an EIS, which is the same process we're going through right now with the state leased lands. But the Army, in fact, never organized itself to complete that EIS. And in fact, the Makua state leased lands are on the table to be returned to the state. And really, again, the impetus is undoubtedly the lawsuit and the community activism that made it hard for the Army to continue using and bombing those lands in the way that they always had previous to this lawsuit, asking for environmental review, but with the goal of stopping the bombing. And they were very successful. And that community is actually organizing right now to think about how to best steward and malama those lands when they come back to the state. And that's a community-led process. OHA has been invited to the meetings, but we are observers and offering support. And it's incredible community-driven process that it's really exciting to see. So that's kind of wraps up the historical section. If we could go ahead, we're going to go through this pretty quickly, but this is just the map at the highest level of the main military leases that are coming up. They're expiring in the next 3 to 5 years. And Pōhakuloa, a lot of folks know about because there's still live fire training there, and it's such a huge area. And I do need to point out that the state lease lands that are being talked about are a small portion of the entire military area. There's about 133,000 acres that are in the training area. Most of it is considered fee simple against federal government land. And then 23,000 acres, a smaller portion, they're leased from the state. So when we're talking about the military lease lands, we're talking about that smaller portion. But of course, the conversation about the future of militarism in Hawaii is much bigger than those lease lands. And then we have the 3 different areas on Oahu, which includes here in Kahuku. And for folks who have not been able to keep up with all the developments, what the Army has stated at the end of the EIS process is that it is planning to give back the Mauka yellow leased portion of state lands at Kahuku, but it's planning to retain that Makai yellow land. And then the remainder of the Kahuku training area, again, is federal fee land. So that is exciting or disappointing how you look at it, but there is at least that Mauka portion of the land that the Army has already indicated it's planning to give back. And then Makua is, as I mentioned, also being planned to give back. And And just a little background on the process leading up to that, that there was an environmental impact statement published for both Pōhakuloa and the Oahu areas last year. There was an opportunity for public comments on the actual huge documents, hundreds of pages, the environmental review document. And those docs were actually presented to the Board of Land and Natural Resources last May for Pōhakuloa and June for Oahu. And in what was kind of a historic moment, the Board of Land and Natural Resources rejected those EIS because it recognized that they were so deficient in terms of documenting cultural and environmental impacts, which is the whole point of doing an EIS in the first place. And I guess I could talk about it now. Some of the things they found were incomplete archaeological surveys, which help to identify iwi, as well as historical sites. There's just a small fraction of the state land at Pōhakuloa that's been inventoried. So how do they know where to protect if they haven't tried to identify where are cultural resources? That was the same with the biological resources, which would include native plants, endangered species. It was the same with cultural practices. How are these lands traditionally used by Native Hawaiians, or how would they be used if we were able to get those lands back? Another area OHA really focused on was remediation. So we have, even for the lands that are coming back to us, there's remediation obligations on behalf of the state, and there was nothing in the environmental review document of what is the long-term costs to clean up these lands that are coming back. What are the federal government's obligations? If the government is right, there's a federal statute, they are gonna have obligations to clean up the land, but practically speaking, there was nothing about how much is that gonna cost. And the reason it's so important is in the case of Kaho'olawe, for example, there was $400 million dedicated to cleanup, and they've only cleaned up a fraction of the island. 66% has not been cleaned up, and the part that has been cleaned up, it's only down to like 4 feet. I'm not sure if I have those figures exactly right, but the point is it's very expensive, and there's still a lot of land that can't even be accessed because of lack of cleanup funds. So these were some of the things that were missing from the environmental impact statement that the boards rejected. Even though the Board of Land and Natural Resources rejected the EIS, the Army went ahead and issued a record of decision, which is basically how it closes out, at least on the federal side, its process. So they basically decided, even though the state is saying it's incomplete, we're going to say under the federal law that it's, we think it complies with the law. And that's when they issued their what's called a record of decision. And you can Google the Army's documents, their environmental review documents for all the different areas, and pull up the record of decision, and they kind of say, this is what we're going to do. We believe we've complied with the process. There is still, of course, the opportunity for the state to help force them to complete a state environmental review process that is more comprehensive. And that is something that OHA has also been working to do, is to try and ensure that any future decisions related to military lease lands at minimum comply with the environmental and also cultural review statutes and rules. Okay, next slide. So I went over some of these points that they're saying they're gonna return the Mauka track and keep the Makai track. This information actually is from the Army's own EIS about what they identified as cultural resources and practices. But again, the board determined that there really hadn't been enough outreach with the community to understand fully what the significance of these areas are to locals and Native Hawaiians. And, you know, one thing I didn't see in the EIS that OHA has been active in trying to support in other areas is, what is the community's access needs? How often does the community, you know, want to access lands or cross lands for hunting or fishing, or however they use the Mauka and Makai parcels? We work, for example, with the Kauai community around better access to PMRF, and trying to make sure that it's easy for the community to come across and have the proper ID and everything to go across the base to get access to the beach side. But we haven't heard a lot from the community about what they want to see around access. So that would also be really helpful to hear tonight from the community if folks have been up to these areas, if they want to go up to these areas, if people want to hunt there, if they want to gather there, if they want to fish there. I didn't really see any of that in the environmental review documents that were completed by the military. So we're going to try and hurry through this last portion because this is a part where it can get a little complicated. So I'm going to try and keep it high level. But we wanted to put out, you know, what are the possibilities of what could happen next? And I already talked about some land back successes, because that is one possibility about land back. And we're actually seeing that with Makua and part of the Kahuku leased lands. We do have land back on the table. So that is a success. Again, there's always the push to get the rest of the land back. And we talked a little bit about how Kaho'olawe was able to mobilize community. But this happens sometimes through the government, like right now with the EIS, with the Army saying they're going to give the land back. It can also happen through community occupation, resistance, and litigation. So this is a very big area of what could happen next. Next slide, please. So another possibility that has been brought up is land exchange. And everything has to go through the Board of Land and Natural Resources when it comes to land disposition of public lands. Whether this would apply, this statute 17195 would apply to whether we see the state move forward with a lease, if we see the state move forward with a land exchange, it would all be under this land governance statute, which entrusts the Board of Land and Natural Resources with decision making. The fact that the decision making is embedded in a state agency is part of what triggers the HRS Chapter 343 environmental review process. If the board is going to make this kind of land disposition, it has to ensure that the applicant complies with the environmental review statute, and also to oversee and protect, again, the state's public trust interest in the land, which is long-term protection, like we talked about with the state v. Ching case. And that's the state's duty. If it is to enter into another lease, what are the terms that would be included in that lease to try and ensure, even if military lease occupation or military use continues for another certain amount of time, that it's subject to certain conditions. And then a concept generally about land exchange and all of these other potential dispositions is that there's also federal laws that apply. And also the idea that there is no just land exchange in Hawaii for lands that are held by the U.S. military, because they are already Crown and government lands that under the Admissions Act and the Public Law 88-233, the federal government already has a duty to give back to the state. So legally, folks have argued there's no such thing as land exchange because the federal government doesn't have anything to exchange. On the other hand, other people have argued that if they're something like recreational lands that wouldn't otherwise be on the table, that might be a possible land exchange. But we have heard from the community that the community does not support land exchange because these are all Crown and government lands. So the federal government can't trade one piece of stolen property for another piece of stolen property. That's the conclusion. And then we have conditional lease renewal, which is the process that was already initiated at the board that I spoke a little bit about. And it's subject to the same statute as a land exchange. It's subject to, again, the environmental law and public trust duties. And we've also heard loud and clear from the community that the community does not want to see lease renewal. We've heard that, yes. We are also raising and in conversation, if there is lease renewal, what are the minimum standards that the federal government should comply with? And again, these are some of the things we've already talked about that the community has also flagged in EIS. is future valuation of land and even past valuation. What is owed for the time the military has already used the land where we were not justly compensated, and what is owed if there is to be a future extension of the leases, and how would that valuation be conducted. And to date, the valuation that the state has done was very much rooted in a property law valuation. What is the market value if you were to sell the land? There's other models from other places in the world, and even in the United States. If you were to value property of cultural significance, environmental significance, that the cost, the rent costs, would have to encompass not just the market value, what would another buyer pay, but all the lost opportunity costs and harms essentially borne by the āina in the community due to this use of the land. And again, cleanup and remediation is always at the forefront, ensuring cultural access and ongoing ability of community to access the land. And if there were again to be a lease, is there any way to tie it to a shorter period of use and a way to phase out and decrease the military footprint over time? So those are some of the concerns that we've raised in the context of the actual lease conversation. And finally, the possibility that Summer had flagged was really being pushed at the end of last summer through December. There were high-level conversations between the Army Secretary Driscoll and the governor of the state of Hawaii, and Governor Green put out basically a set of conditions of what he thought Hawaii would be willing to sell the land for. And it included quote unquote public benefits like more housing, more infrastructure, funding of different community education, things like that. But it all operated from the premise that the United States was going to confiscate the fee, the underlying fee, and the public land and the state nature of these lands. And that was where OHA drew a red line and really became part of the conversation, because we said, under no circumstances, given again our constitutional role, can we see the federal government alienate public lands and take them, regardless of what the governor was putting on the table as what he thought was a fair exchange. And we have a little more of the timeline of the recent past at the end of the presentation, but this is, just if folks don't know, it's the government's prerogative. They have the right under the Constitution to exercise eminent domain and take land, private and other public lands, with the condition being just compensation, or what again, it would be the market value. Usually if this goes into the court, that's how they value the land. So that's another limitation of the, if a condemnation were to occur, it's the public, just the fair market value. There are other restraints. There's Title 10, which is part of the US statute. And what it does is it puts a requirement on the federal armed services. That would include the Army, which right now occupies Pōhakuloa, to explore all other avenues before exercising its condemnation power. So to make sure that there wasn't any other exchange, lease renewal, other arrangement that could avoid condemnation. Again, we've heard from the community, they are not interested in those other possibilities either, but that is the duty of the federal government to make sure that condemnation is a path of last resort, which was part of the problem with Governor Green's approach, is that they were skipping the federal government's duty. They were basically relieving the federal government of this duty to make sure condemnation is the last possible option that is exercised. Next slide, please. And right now, OHA is not engaged in any international work, but we wanted to acknowledge, again, from the community, one of the things we've heard when we've done other presentations is there's a strong portion of our community that feels that international law is the most effective way to deal with U.S. military in Hawaii. And there's differences, there's different options, there's different rights that would apply. There's the law of decolonization that applies to occupied territories. There is United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognizes separately from occupied territories, which are, you know, all citizens, separately the rights of indigenous people. There's international criminal law and deoccupation. And of course, just human rights principles that would support demilitarization to the extent that it's prohibiting or impeding the exercise of people's human rights, including cultural rights. So these are some of the international pathways we know other members of the community are exploring. Next slide, please. And I'm going to breeze through this portion, but you know, we did want to recognize that people have their own ability to lobby and reach out to decision makers and make their voices heard directly, not just, you know, through OHA or through your elected representatives. So we kind of wanted to go through who are the main decision makers and what role do they play. The United States Congress actually has a lot of power with respect to what happens next. And I might ask Summer if she wants to say anything, but OHA had a delegation that went to DC in April. And part of the reason is because Congress actually has to provide the funding if there were to be condemnation or any other lease or military disposition. And so Congress also has power to ask the armed services in that capacity as the person who gives them money what else they could do. So we've also seen some language that hasn't been enacted, but in different drafts of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is how the Congress funds the armed services, but in that act to require that the military complete its environmental impact statement that the state has asked for it to improve. So that's something we've seen. It hasn't been finalized as a condition of future funding, but that is part of the power that the Congress exercises with respect to military lands. Do you want to say anything more about that?
I think maybe one interesting footnote is that in OHA's the delegation's lobbying effort at the national level, we found that there was a lot of reception to this idea that as a state constitutionally mandated agency responsible for being the representative voice of the indigenous people of this land, that there was a bipartisan understanding and acceptance that that particular point had validity. And so the irony for us is that many times, I think one of the limitations that our community, and understandably so, associates with OHA is its state constitutional character, right? It's sort of like you're a part of the state arm, so there's we question the legitimacy of our ability to really zealously and adamantly advocate for Native Hawaiian positions. In this administration, and when I say this administration, I mean the Trump and the Republican administration, states' rights are like gold, right? Like states' rights, the opportunity for states to individually exercise their autonomy and not be beholden to some, overbearing, overreaching federal behemoth, if you will, is at the core of traditional Republican principles. And so the fact that OHA, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, is embedded in the state constitution, the fact that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is also explicitly authorized by our state statutes, and the fact that we came into existence by way of a constitutional convention, so that all of the residents of the state of Hawaii believed that an Office of Hawaiian Affairs was necessary to make good on the Admissions Act, which was a condition for Hawaii becoming part of the United States of America, really resonated with Republican leadership who were really the deciding authorities on many of the committees that are determining the future of armed services, footprints across the country, the responsibility to remediate military lands on state lands before they're returned. So, all that to say is that I think underscoring Lena Ala's point from earlier is that this conversation requires multiple strategic pathways to obtaining the same shared goal and objective, which is the return of these lands and the return of these lands to our stewardship. And if OHA in some circles has to cloak itself in its state constitutional character, well, and if that advances the conversation for our beneficiaries, then we will do that. That is our charge. And if in other conversations we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kanaka who are making international legal arguments or who are demanding the complete return of these military lease lands, like imminently as opposed to down the line, then we need to be in those spaces too. But we also need everyone who has subject matter expertise in their respective spaces and who have authority to speak in their respective spaces to do so with this collective unified voice that advances our cause towards the arc that we're all trying to get to. So I think that was a very unexpected takeaway from the conversations we were having at the federal level.
Okay, I'm gonna try and go as quickly through these. You have the handouts if you want to know more, ask question about the legal frameworks. I'm trying to get us to the community listening part. Let me see if there's anything I really want to highlight here. I think we've touched a lot upon a lot of these points as BLNR being an important decision maker. Actually, on the prior slide, there was one thing I did want to highlight is the legislature has the ultimate authority to amend HRS 171, which is a statute governing lands, and also to do, they're the gatekeeper for constitutional amendments. So OHA actually had a bill last year as part of its package to ban live fire training on public lands. And we actually have a handout about it in the front. And the legislature, and that would have been a ballot initiative. So eventually all the voters in the state would have had an opportunity to vote, should we stop live fire training on public lands? But it didn't even get a single hearing in the Hawaii state legislature. So I did want to just highlight that the legislature has a role to play. It might not have exerted itself yet. It might have, for whatever reasons, felt it was too political, but that bill did not move. And at this point, we are planning to reintroduce it, and it's part of one of our handouts. So I do think that's important to highlight about the legislature. I think we can move through this. The judicial branch would come into play if there is a condemnation case, or of course, if community again brings a lawsuit, which is what the state beaching case was to enforce public trust. Next slide, please. And then this is where we started. We're getting to the end. We're back to what OHA's role and responsibilities are. And this is really, again, part of what this session is today. We want to hear from community. Our role is to defend Native Hawaiian rights, elevate community voices, hold the state accountable, make sure that the public land trust is protected and not alienated, that OHA and therefore Hawaiians get their fair share of public land trust revenues, and ensure transparency for the community. Again, when these leases were passed or signed 65 years ago, there wasn't a strong Native Hawaiian representative, and really Native Hawaiians hadn't had their rights recognized in the same way as we're able to assert our rights today. So it's very important that OHA be involved in that. And then we have a more detailed timeline about what we've done over the past few years that I'm gonna just leave so we can get to the consultation. I would highlight two things from the timeline. The first is just recognizing that the community really came out ahead in many ways. There was a gathering at Iolani Palace on September 2nd of last year when the community made a set of demands about what over 40 Native Hawaiian organizations and other Aloha āina groups wanted to see happen as far as the military lease negotiations and community consultation. And some of those leaders from those groups came to OHA and said, we want to see OHA take action. So that's really last November, after hearing back from community, that we introduced to the Board of Trustees and were approved to go out on these community listening sessions, to sign on to the statement that had already been released, and to move forward more publicly. There had already been an internal working group formed to examine this issue. It's been on OHA's horizon for a long time. And as I mentioned, we've been in the EIS process. We've been demanding accountability for many, many years. But what changed in November was really this mandate to go public, to have these consultations. We have a community advisory, a smaller group that's advising OHA on next steps and how to engage. And yeah, we continue to hopefully take our lead from community. That's one of our goals here. And I will leave the timeline for any further questions, but we want to turn it over now, I think, for question and answer, unless you have any closing words. Summer, you'd like to say before we do that?
Really just mahalo for sharing your evening with us and affording us the grace to do this external facing presentation, share with you some of the work we've been undertaking, because we feel that this conversation is this generation's most significant contribution to present and future generations. Rarely is there an opportunity to lay claim to tens of thousands of acres at once, and to do so with, you know, not just led by Kanaka, but supported by Kanaka allies. And we think that, you know, the feedback, the momentum, the conversation, the fluency with which people are speaking about this issue now, and again, how we've moved from the margins to the mainstream is remarkable in the amount of time that has been accomplished. So mahalo for listening, and now it's our turn to listen to all of you. Royce, can I give you this? So we are going to have our staff walk around. If you raise your hand, you have a question, we'll be happy to do that. I have a question from the audience here, and so if everybody's okay, I'm gonna take that question. And then I'm sorry, for housekeeping purposes, do we have somebody waiting to share?
No, just
okay.
Questions.
Okay, I have a couple. Thank you so much for reserving your questions for this, and I'm going to go through it. After I respond, everybody will have the opportunity to give their feedback and mana'o as well. Because of the number of folks in the room and our limitations in terms of having this space, we're going to ask that we kind of keep to a 5-minute sharing, if that's possible. And then if we have more time, we will absolutely allow for more time, but we want to make sure that everybody who seeks to share some mana'o tonight have the opportunity to do so before we do like a second round of sharing, if that's okay. But I'm going to read the first question. How much longer does the military need our lands, and what is their present purpose for these lands? I can well, at least, and we hosted a workshop on this topic with a number of community leaders who are subject matter experts on this issue at Hawaiian Council Convention. And among the people on our panel was Ryan Kanakaole, who is the new chair of the Board of Land and Natural Resources and the head of the DLNR. And he actually shared that right now, the totality of lands already earmarked for being returned to the state of Hawaii by the collective of armed services, so that's the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, is approximately 10,000. Pardon? Was it? So, so I'm going to go with the more conservative number. I had notes in my phone that it was 10, but Lena Ala is saying it's about 4,000. Yes, being returned. 40? No. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm gonna go with the notes that I took from that day, which was approximately 10,000 acres of land have been identified by the armed services as no longer sort of necessary for their continued use. And so conversations and intentions have been identified about the return of those lands. Approximately 40,000 acres are at play in the expiring lease terms, all of which conclude in between 2029 and 2031. So that's the answer to, the very technical question about how much longer, at least my interpretation, under existing military leases, do the military need these lands? So 2029 to 2031 for some 30,000 acres, and at the conclusion of 2029 for 10,000 acres, after which they're returned to the state of Hawaii. And what is their present purpose for the lands? I mean, there is clearly some lands that are still being used for military exercises, including destructive live fire training, which is one of the conditions that we'd like to limit if a new lease is contemplated and negotiated with the state of Hawaii. There are lands that are used for other military activities that are not live fire training destructive. Kauai is one of them, although rockets are sort of, I'm not great at the technical terms, but rockets are discharged from the military base on Kauai into our oceans, which is also, our interpretation of Malama āina would include that kind of activity prohibition. But can you think of other uses that?
So I'll just share again the parts that the military said they're going to come back is Mako, which we know has a lot of live fire damage and it's very difficult to clean up. Po'amoho near Wahiawa is another area, and my understanding from the EIS is that was just used more for like helicopter landing and takeoff kind of training. So when I was on that panel with Ryan the other week, he actually described the land coming back there as pretty much pristine forest. That was his word, was pristine. So that's interesting that we're gonna get back lands from the military that are in good condition. And then again, the Kahuku track is the Mauka one, which it's not really clear to me from what I've read, and I'd be happy to hear from the community about how that area has been used historically by the military. But there's so many different ways in addition to live fire. There's the parachuting, there's just the jungle scenario training. There's just so many different range of activity. So why the Kahuku land being offered back to the state? Did they ruin it? So good question. And I think that is a fair, do they give us back the land when it's just too hard? They don't want to clean it up. That's a fair question. And I kind of touched on that one. The Po'amoho land, interesting again, that it's pristine. I'm surprised. I was surprised Ryan said that. And I thought that's an opportunity. The Kahuku land, maybe we can ask for a community tour and see the condition that the land is in. Yeah, is it hard to get access? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the community doesn't have any kind of access right now to.
With that 6 months, they can clean up their act. And of course, it's a guided tour. You don't get access to wherever you want to go. They tell you where you can go. So, as we all know, that's how the military operates, right? So, this land that they want to give back, how many acres?
The Kahuku, I would have to look off the top of my head. I'm sure it's pretty small. It's a few hundred acres. The tract up here, they back.
That's KTA 1 and KTA 2.
3. It's I think they're calling it tract 1 that they're keeping and tract 3 that they're giving back. Let me double check. It's in the presentation here. So if you're familiar with the tract numbers, it's the Malka is A3 that they're saying they're going to give back, and they're going to keep A1, which is the Makai one.
And which
I would have to look up. I think it's about 450 acres is my understanding, but I would have to double check that.
in total or
Yeah,
in total?
for the return portion, yeah.
This year, the
Mhm.
EIS was deficient in setting out cleanup commitments.
That was our reading, yes,
Yeah.
and the BLNR agreed.
How will OHA be able to monitor? Not, they're going to do a better job. The military.
Yeah, so maybe you could help with that, Summer, but we are trying to engage in that process. We do not yet have a consulting role with what happens next. We have asked the Army to consult with OHA. We've asked the governor to ask for OHA's inclusion or include us in all federal to state talks about next steps. And while Summer, as she mentioned, she sits on the governor's advisory group, they call it, OHA does not have a formal consulting role. So we do not have as much insight perhaps as other state agencies might have, but we are actively pushing to have that formal consultation role to help shape some of these determinative questions, including how is going to operate in practice.
Okay, just to let you know, my name is Linnell Damate. I am with Lauailu Alliance, as well as the Oahu Water Protectors, as well as the Shutdown Red Hill Coalition and Save Sharks Cove Alliance. But anyway, born and raised here in Kahuku, I've seen a lot of things going on, from a little bit too much. And we did have a warning come out here to this school, the elementary school, where there's unexploded ordinances also in the trails back here. So I know a lot of Kahuku is so out of the way. Who really cares? Yeah, but all of us, we all care. So if you can get your foot in the door, push the government to give you guys more say, more capabilities to truly observe and be a part of this process, and make sure that people here do benefit from that effort. Thank you.
Mahalo. And I would ask if folks haven't signed in either hard copy or with the QR code that you do, so that we can follow up with folks who identify themselves and sound like we could work together. We would really like to capture that in our either online or hard copy.
And I will say that on this particular issue, this is and mahalo for identifying all of the organizations and the Huis that you're working with, because we in this moment, staying silent or on the sidelines as like supportive observers and but quiet cheerleaders is not going to get into the ears of the people who are making decisions. And OHA just all by itself saying, no, we represent, all of the voices of the Native Hawaiian community, and doing that even in my official capacity, sitting at the governor's table alone, like that sole voice, not enough. And so part of the ask about filling out the surveys is when we have data to back us up, when we have coalitions and a dedicated group of folks who, when the kahea is made, like we show up in really strong numbers, and for whatever reasons you show up with your own hui and your own coalition. You don't have to piggyback on OHA, but just show up into these spaces and into these conversations when the kahea starts coming, because it will come, because it will be necessary to come. Because at the latest governor's meeting, which was earlier this week, the Army has taken a very resistant stance towards completing the environmental impact statement, of resubmitting it. The other parts of the armed services are still complying, are still moving through the process, have expressed really a good faith intention to come before the land board and to make their best case for their environmental impact statements and applications, and working some in really meaningful ways with community. But the Army at this point in time has taken the position that, notwithstanding our congressional leaders mandating and urging very strongly that they complete the process, are sort of being very stubborn at the moment. And if they maintain that position, if they don't move through the legal state processes that allow for a review and allow for negotiations, then what they're signaling is that last resort. And we need to continue to encourage anyone who has influence over the Army to come to the table and be good neighbors, be good stewards in these spaces. And we can't do that silently. We have to use our leo in this moment.
Aloha kako. My name is Renee Fonoi Moana, and I'm from the Kaua Hawaiian Civic Club. I just wanted to share that the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, we wrote resolutions specifically about Kahuku. So I want you to just know that the groups in the community, KWA and Kaua Hawaiian Civic Club, has been involved in some process of letting our voices be heard, that we are here in a community. We need our lineal descendants to be on these committees so that they can share their mana'o, which we believe is very critical. And so I just want to acknowledge you all and thank you for coming out and supporting this. And we stand by no military leases. We need to get our āina back for our people. Mahalo nui.
And thank you. Auntie raises an excellent point. That's a good reminder. OHA is also doing a kapa'akai analysis for every single military footprint here. And what's critical, another reason to sign up for this survey and to leave your name and contact information, is because the point of the kapa'akai analysis is to document all of the ways in which our Native Hawaiian practitioners and descendants have pilina and require access and are doing a continuity of practice on these lands that need to be identified, safeguarded, and any harm or injury to those things mitigated and or eliminated. So this is a really critical part of the EIS process. And because it is so Native Hawaiian Kanaka-centric, we wanted to make sure that we were going to use our resources to ensure that that was as robust and comprehensive and prudent as possible. So your participation in those interviews and those documentations are going to be really critical to supporting our position. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Helani Sonoda Pale with Kalahui Hawaii, Oahu Water Protectors, Red Hill Coalition, many other groups. Pu'uhonoa Wailupe. I'm glad to hear OHA's asking for a comprehensive EIS. That's been our position, Kalahui's position, is to continue on with the EIS process. If we do not know the damage that has been done, we do not know what needs to be cleaned up. And only the Army can really tell us what they have done, because they operate under national security secrecy. So I'd like to see the EIS process for Oahu and Pōhakuloa to continue, so that we know the extent of the damage. And I want to just point out, I know that you guys were asking for information about Kahuku. The last time I was here, we had that huge Kahuku hearing for the EIS, and there was tons of information shared in that meeting. If you want to go back, you have people who were hunters, hikers, people from the community talking about what's up there and what they've experienced. And I think those are all really good mo'olelo and stories could probably add to your folder for the leases. I'm also glad as a Kanaka Maoli that this a Hawaiian agency with all your resources and your mission, your constitutionally mandated mission, is actually taking on this issue. And I was there testifying, asking OHA to please step in as well. So I was one of those testifiers. I do have concerns. This is my concern, and I think Kalahui Hawaii's concern about non-natives sitting at the table. When you talk about land back, it should go back to the people from whom the land was taken. And I'm glad to hear that you're doing the Kapakai analysis. It's like everything I was thinking of. I'm glad I came to this meeting. OHA's kind of addressed with the Kapakai analysis. I know when we had the EIS hearings for both Pōhakuloa and Oahu lands, there was no consultation with the Ahamoku and so that was a whole issue that had to be cleared up. And so that's really important, and to include the lineal descendants into this process. I think it's super important. Community is important, yes, but Kanaka Maoli come first. And I think we need to hear from them first. They need to be at the table. Especially the lineal descendants. So that's just my mana'o, and I want to mahalo you. And yes, we need to end the leases now, and they cannot be renewed. Mahalo nui. Aloha.
Aloha, my Kaua, Ben Schaefer. Just a couple of notes. The military has over 400 plus bases around the world. Right? They are not fighting for freedom, and they haven't been fighting for freedom for over 75 years. That's all fake news, number one. They do not need that money for war because they just create war every place they go. Colonial history proves that that's what they are, a genocide bunch of white people. And so we need to keep repeating that action over and over again until the mainstream, and actually they've already caught it from the genocide in Palestine, where we have been complicit and part of that whole deal. And so now it's the easiest point now to get on board because nobody is buying that story, right? So your guys' job is to work with our county and state legislatures and our federal legislatures and bust them up and put them all in line and make sure that they're all going to him, the governor, and say, this is what we want for OHA. You got to do that. You got to strong arm them. And you want them to be a part of that. Number two is at Makua. I've been there a couple of times with Auntie Lynette Cruz, and when they go there, they malama whatever artifacts they have, heiaus, whatever they can find. I think Kahuku, we can probably do the same thing. And on the other places, we get in there, we malama the areas first, and then the military realize that we are one and one with the land, right? And that's where they get into it. And that can be the whole island should be part of that plan. And so, and number three is that the bypass road should be one of the first negotiation that the community, they can open it up so that the community can use it. Yeah, and so, yeah, drum roll. And so that should be a priority so that the community get the transportation. I mean, the way to get somewhere easier and faster than what they're doing right now. You know, and so when I was in DC a couple of years ago, when Danny Noy was in office, I was taking a group of students, and I noticed at Danny Noy's office they had all these generals and colonels all standing in line, waiting to get in to see him. What I learned from that is that some of those in federal office have the power of the purse because they're going to go see him for money. They always got to go see somebody in Congress for money. And that is what our 4 congressional delegates got to do. They gotta swing the bat and say, no, this is what you're gonna do. This is what you're gonna do because we're over here. Pat Caffey's over here. All of the big shots in the military are here, and we have to do better. You know, all of us need to do better. But anyway, that's it. Thank you. Oh, Ben Schaefer.
Mahalo.
I'm from Kahana Bay.
Beautiful. Mahalo. Let's see. I was going to quickly respond. You know, we have made progress with the executive office, the governor specifically, in moving the conversation from absolutely aole oha, you know, you're going to just be part of this advisory committee, to let's have a meaningful conversation about how you can add to the conversation on behalf of the representative voice. And I think honestly, the constitutional mandate and what we've been hammering home in order to get a seat at the table, not just as a observer, but as an actual negotiating party for the part of the public land trust that is our kuleana and our kuleana alone, to uphold and maintain. The governor went on record at the Hawaiian Council Convention saying that he was pledging to have a conversation with our chair, Kahele, about OHA's role in the military lease conversation going forward, which is going to be distinct from OHA's representative role in his governor's advisory committee, which is a whole coalition of voices as opposed to acknowledging OHA's unique constitutional and statutory mandate. So that conversation has yet to happen, but will happen. Chair Kahele confirmed that pledge was in fact made, and I think that that's a good sign of the progress that we've made so far. Auntie Lynette was on our panel at that Hawaiian Council workshop, and I just, I took some notes because she was giving such gems, such pearls that day, and one of them speaks to what you just said. And she said, and I'm kind of quoting or paraphrasing at least, that their organization, their Hui's ability to access land reminded them, reinforced for them how to be Kanaka and love āina and each other, right? Like just love on the land that is in your backyard, and take care of it. And as you take care of it, necessarily if other people join you, you start to take care of each other. And start where you start. Like you don't have to take on tens of thousands of acres at once. You can take on a half an acre and grow your malama value in increments and bring other people along with you. And she said, take care and defend it now and show up now. Because even if your lands are not under seized now, chances are they will be, particularly if you leave them fallow and abandoned and unnurtured. And that was a thoughtful reminder too, And so mahalo for bringing that point home, because that point is really important. I'm going to answer another. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to Uncle Ben Schaefer, same age, Ben Schaefer's comments, and that was about the Kahuku range, the military use of Kahuku. Malpa and Makai is important to the residents because we've been stuck at Waimea Bay when it's fall, and we have no other out except to come around the other way or have single lane use of the area. So it's important that we take back the Makai portion as well, because that's where Ben mentioned the drum road is, and that's an alternative use, but we've never been able to use it when Kamehameha Highway poses. So that's an important portion. In fact, all the lands are important because, the nationhood of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maui, have not survived in their own lands over all these years under any kind of shared use with the federal government on military lands. You look at who was awarded DHHL, qualify for those new homes. But when you look at the military bases and the future of the military here, I mean, I can see Hawaiians in those barracks. I can see Hawaiians on the land that houses military families. And I just don't see how we can take another 100+ years of military presence in Hawaii that would ever help Hawaii in this nation. And if sovereignty exists, like some of us believe, there must be laws that can uphold the betterment of our people.
Hi everybody, my name is Kalani, and this is a question more so wondering if you guys can explain like the legal framework behind it. But my understanding is that the NDAA is drafted every year, every fiscal year, and the only thing keeping the military in negotiations for leases instead of condemnation is that Title 10. And I also understand, from my understanding, is that the U.S. codes or that title can also be like revised. And I was wondering, like, does OHA have some sort of idea of like how to keep the military accountable on whatever they say they're gonna do, instead of, I don't know, further down the line, 2028 comes around and they just redraft the NDAA to say they no longer want to negotiate leases, they want to do condemnation.
I'm going to say the honest answer is we can control what we can control. And there is quite a bit of uncertainty when it comes to the enforceability of laws. I mean, I think we're seeing it at the federal level that even court orders are at times ignored or not complied with. I think, to Uncle's point, it's getting our state and county leaders on the same page about where Hawaii will stand on the question is going to be probably the most powerful enforceability and accountability measure. And one that I think a broader continental leadership, even in this administration, would respect if our state actors were as resolute as I hear everyone in this room being tonight about the positions and the stances that we're going to be taking. Mahalo for being as fluent as you are in the NDAA and the authorities that grants. You are not wrong, that you are absolutely correct that every year that gets reissued, renegotiated. The language and the terms that end up making it into the final congressionally approved articulation is what are the orders and the limitations of what the armed services and the military can do all across the country, including in Hawaii. And right now, there is not explicit language in the NDAA that says no condemnation, but there is sort of like footnoted language about urging the armed services to comply with state law, including the EIS. I think we have strong congressional delegates who are making that point every time they have an opportunity to do so, recognizing that they are in the minority of that landscape at the federal level at this moment in time, but they still wield quite a bit of power and influence, nonetheless, because Some of them have very senior positions on really important committees, including the appropriations and including the security councils. And so we have advocates. I think one of the most vocal advocates, I'm going to give her kudos, is Congresswoman Takuda. I mean, she is really hammering home the point very explicitly. No condemnation, recognize Kanaka voices, perspectives, consultation, like everything that we are echoing here in this room. And I really want to commend her for stepping outside of, you know, everyone else's sort of comfort zone and being really bold and courageous in that space for Kanaka. I think too that, what else? So that, I mean, that's the honest answer. We will do everything we can within our purview and our legal abilities to advocate, to protect these lands and hold the military accountable. But at the end of the day, we do what we can do, and I hope every single one of you and all of your coalitions and Huis do everything you can do as well, because it's gonna take a nation like a Lahui to get this over the finish line. I do want to answer some of these other cards if there's no other questions. Oh, I see one. Go ahead.
My name is Evelyn Lane. I'm from Kahuku here, and I'm born on Oahu. I am concerned about the health risks that the military causes to our community, to ourselves and to the creatures that live here. I think that they have showed the most poor record of being honest and faithful to the things that, and considering from the very beginning, and I'll just say that my cousin is Grover Cleveland. So I think that it is really rotten that everything that we're have to these laws that nobody else is living by in this country at this time. And the more that we're subjected to this, the stress that it causes, I believe that the military has an obligation to look for other sites that have less fragile environments, and that it's part of their law. And that is another thing that they should have when they wanted to do the military range on the Big Island. They should have taken it to Seattle or some other place where they had opportunity to do the same thing. And this is going over and over and over again. And I don't believe and I don't trust anything that the military would tell me right now. Based on that record, I don't think that we should trust. And I hope that in the recommendations that the governor and you all make is that you put in some requirements that when we catch them doing something that they're not supposed to, because we're going to end up keeping these leases, that we should be able to be compensated. We shouldn't have to go to court. They should just do the right thing when we show them that they've done the wrong thing. And if we're going to get some compensation for these leases, they should compensate all of the individual families who have had unexploded ordinances falling into their yard, and for the 10,000 acres that they burned up in Makua. They couldn't even do a controlled fire. I would have rather had all the people that worked at the sugar plantation taking care of fires on this island. We should never let the military have access to a flame, ever. They don't know how to deal with our island. They think they know more about this place than everybody here besides me, because I don't know as much either, and I wouldn't expect to. But I want to say to everybody here that believes that your descendants should be the first people to speak up, I agree with you. But you need us. We're here to support you because we love you and we love this āina as much. And without you, this place wouldn't even live in. I wouldn't have the joy that I have every day because of the people that live here. So thank you.
You talk about decolonization. There's a wonderful paper by a Kenyan man, author, called Decolonization of the Mind. That, counting on, have been colonized. And that is unfortunately somewhat true. Fortunately, people are waking up. But that is what has been done throughout the world. I apologize that my people have been so vicious and colonized. I can only say that you must realize that that is a tactic. They're counting on it. They're counting on your obedience because that's part of colonization. You must stand up. And it can't, I can stand up, it means very little. But that is what the military is counting on.
I just want to say that we're just very grateful that we could have you guys come out here to let us know what's going on, and it is our right and our decision to get our families out here to see what is happening and what needs to be done. I think it's a great time for us, all of us, the Kanaka Maoli, to be here to give our mana'o and to see where Oha, you know, for a long time we were just wondering what was Oha all about in the very beginning. And we're just very glad that you guys would come all the way out here to Ko'olauloa to give us a chance to give you guys our mana'o. E Hawaii e kuhone hanau e kuhome kula ivine olino au ina polani o e Hawaii aloha e. Maha.
But they see two of our presenters or any of us. The question.